There were German soldiers living in her house, not visiting, not passing through, but billeted there, sleeping under her roof, eating at the edges of her life, coming and going with the casual authority of occupiers who owned everything they surveyed. And in the attic above their heads, hidden in a space they never thought to search, 13 human beings were holding their breath. 13 people whose lives depended entirely on a teenage girl keeping her nerve, day after day, month after month, with the enemy quite literally underfoot. One sound at the wrong moment, one careless word, one soldier who climbed the wrong stairs, and it would all be over, for the hidden and for the girl who hid them. This is the story of Stefania Podgórska, and one of the most astonishing acts of courage of the entire war. This is a story about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, about the immense courage that can dwell in the most unassuming person, and about the daily grinding heroism of those who chose to protect the persecuted at the risk of their own lives. It is a story that unfolds not on a battlefield, but in a house, in the most intimate and domestic of settings, where the stakes were nonetheless as high as any in the war. And it reveals the remarkable truth that some of the greatest heroes of that dark time were not soldiers or leaders, but young people who simply refused to let the innocent be destroyed. To understand what Stefania did, you have to understand the world she was living in, and we will describe it with the gravity it deserves. Her country had been occupied by a brutal regime engaged in the systematic persecution and murder of Jewish people. For the Jews living under this occupation, the situation was catastrophic. They were being rounded up, confined, and ultimately murdered in vast numbers as part of a deliberate campaign of annihilation. To be Jewish under this regime was to face a death sentence, and the only hope of survival for many lay in hiding, in finding some place of concealment, and some person willing to take the enormous risk of sheltering them. But sheltering Jews was extraordinarily dangerous, perhaps the most dangerous thing a person could do under that occupation. The regime had made it absolutely clear that anyone caught hiding Jews would face the most severe consequences, typically death, often not just for the individual responsible, but for their entire family. The penalty was designed to be so terrifying that it would deter anyone from helping, to ensure that the persecuted would find no refuge, that they would be isolated and exposed and ultimately delivered to their fate. To hide a Jew was to risk everything, to place your own life and the lives of those you loved in mortal danger. It was into this world of terror and persecution that Stefania Podgórska, a young Polish woman, made a choice that would define her life and save many others. She was just a teenager, working in a shop, living an ordinary life as much as anyone could under the occupation. She had known Jewish people before the persecution intensified, had worked alongside them, had formed bonds of friendship and humanity that the regime's ideology of hatred could not erase. And when those people faced destruction, when the machinery of murder closed in around them, Stefania did not turn away. She decided to help, to use whatever means she had to shelter and protect people who would otherwise be killed. Now, we should be honest about the history here, because Stefania Podgórska's story is real and well documented, and it deserves to be told accurately and with the respect it commands. What follows is grounded in the genuine record of her extraordinary courage, though we will tell it as a narrative to convey its full human weight. The core is true. A young Polish woman really did hide a substantial number of Jewish people in her home over an extended period, even as German soldiers were billeted in the same house at constant and enormous risk to her own life. The details are recounted to illuminate the magnitude of what she accomplished. The number of people Stefania sheltered was remarkable, more than a dozen human beings concealed in her home. Think about what that meant in practical terms, the sheer difficulty and danger of it. More than a dozen people had to be hidden, fed, and kept safe day after day in a space that had to remain concealed from the outside world. They had to be provided with food, which was scarce under the occupation, and which had to be obtained without arousing suspicion, because no household could explain the need for so much food. They had to be kept silent and hidden, their presence undetectable to anyone who might come to the house. And all of this had to be sustained over a long period, with the constant threat of discovery hanging over everything. The challenge of feeding so many hidden people was itself enormous and is worth dwelling on because it illustrates the daily heroism involved. Food was rationed and scarce, and a young woman buying enough food for more than a dozen people would immediately attract dangerous attention. Stefania had to find ways to obtain the necessary food without revealing that she was feeding far more people than her household could account for. This required constant ingenuity, careful management, and nerve, the daily task of keeping more than a dozen people fed in a time of scarcity, without ever giving away the secret that their lives depended upon. It was a logistical challenge of life and death, repeated every single day. And then there was the almost unimaginable danger that came when German soldiers were billeted in the very house where the Jews were hidden. This is the detail that elevates Stefania's story to the realm of the truly extraordinary. The occupiers, needing accommodation for their personnel, placed soldiers in her home, the same home where, in a concealed space, more than a dozen Jewish people were hiding. Imagine the terror of that situation. The enemy was now living in the house, present day and night, with the hidden people just out of sight, separated from discovery by the thinnest of margins. Every moment carried the risk that a soldier might hear something, notice something, stumble upon the hiding place. The danger, already immense, became almost beyond comprehension. Consider the nerve that this required, the sheer psychological strength of maintaining such a deception with the enemy underfoot. Stefania had to go about her daily life, interacting with the soldiers, appearing normal and unremarkable, all while knowing that more than a dozen people were hidden just out of sight, all while bearing the crushing weight of their dependence on her. She could not show fear. She could not make a mistake. She could not let the strain crack her composure, because any sign of nervousness might arouse suspicion and lead to discovery. Day after day, she maintained this extraordinary performance, keeping her nerve in a situation of almost unbearable tension, with the lives of more than a dozen people and her own life hanging on her ability to remain calm. The psychological burden of this is difficult to fully grasp. To live in a state of constant extreme danger, to bear sole responsibility for the lives of many people, to maintain a perfect facade of normalcy while the enemy lived in your home, all of this would test the limits of anyone's endurance. And Stefania was young, barely more than a girl, carrying this immense weight on her shoulders. The strength required was not the strength of a single dramatic moment, but the sustained strength of endurance, the ability to bear an almost intolerable burden day after day, week after week, month after month, without breaking. It is a kind of courage that is easy to underestimate, but that is, in truth, among the most demanding forms of heroism there is. It is worth reflecting on what motivated Stefania to take on such an enormous risk, because it speaks to something profound about human nature. She was under no compulsion to help. She could have protected herself by doing nothing, by keeping her head down, by refusing to take on the deadly danger of sheltering the persecuted. Many people, understandably frightened, made that choice. But Stefania chose differently. She chose to risk her own life to save others, to act on her conscience and her compassion rather than her self-interest and her fear. What drove her was a fundamental sense of human solidarity, a recognition that the people facing destruction were human beings deserving of help, a refusal to accept the regime's ideology that some lives were worthless and could be destroyed. This points to one of the most important truths illuminated by the dark history of that time, the truth about the choices available even in the worst circumstances. The occupation created a world of terrible moral pressure, in which helping the persecuted meant risking death, and in which the safe choice was to do nothing. In such a world, it would have been easy to conclude that resistance was impossible, that self-preservation demanded compliance, that one had no choice but to look away. But Stefania's example proves otherwise. Even in that world of terror, the choice to help remained available to those with the courage to make it. Her heroism is a testament to the enduring reality of moral choice, to the fact that even under the most extreme pressure, people can choose compassion over fear. Consider, too, the contrast between Stefania and the regime she was resisting. The regime represented the triumph of hatred, the systematic dehumanization and murder of people deemed inferior. Stefania represented the opposite, the affirmation of human dignity, the refusal to accept that any person was worthless, the willingness to risk everything to protect the innocent. In her small house, in her concealed attic, a battle was being fought between these two visions of humanity, and Stefania's choice to shelter the persecuted was a victory for the side of decency and compassion. Against the vast machinery of murder, she set the simple, powerful force of one person's refusal to let the innocent be destroyed. There is a profound lesson here about the power of individual action in the face of collective evil. The persecution that Stefania resisted was a vast organized campaign, backed by the full power of a brutal state. Against such overwhelming force, what could one young woman do? The answer, it turns out, is a great deal. By her individual choice to help, Stefania saved more than a dozen lives, more than a dozen human beings who would otherwise have been murdered. She could not stop the persecution, could not save everyone, could not defeat the regime, but she could save those she was able to reach, and she did. Her story is a powerful reminder that individual action matters, that one person's courage can make an enormous difference, that even against the greatest evil, the choice to help is never futile. It is worth honoring the sustained nature of Stefania's heroism, because it was not a single act, but a prolonged ordeal. She did not save these people in one dramatic moment and then return to safety. She sheltered them over an extended period, bearing the danger and the burden continuously, day after day, for a long time. This sustained heroism, this willingness to bear an immense risk, not once but continuously over months, is in some ways even more remarkable than a single act of bravery. It required not just courage in a moment of crisis, but the endurance to maintain that courage over a long and grinding ordeal, never knowing when discovery might come, never able to relax, always bearing the weight of the lives that depended on her. Consider the youth of Stefania, because it adds another dimension to the magnitude of what she accomplished. She was a teenager, young and without the resources or experience that might have made her task easier. Yet she took on a responsibility that would have daunted the most capable adult, and she carried it with extraordinary skill and courage. There is something deeply moving about the image of this young woman, barely more than a girl, shouldering such an immense burden, protecting so many lives, outwitting the enemy who lived in her own home. Her youth makes her achievement all the more remarkable, a testament to the capacity for heroism that can dwell even in the young. There is also a reflection to be drawn here about the nature of true heroism, about how it often looks nothing like the popular image. We tend to imagine heroes as warriors, as figures of dramatic action and visible glory. But Stefania's heroism was quiet and domestic, expressed in the careful management of a household secret, in the daily task of feeding hidden people, in the maintenance of a calm facade under unbearable pressure. There were no medals in the moment, no recognition, no glory, only the constant danger and the heavy responsibility. This kind of quiet heroism, performed without fanfare and at enormous personal risk, is in many ways the purest form of courage, motivated not by the desire for glory, but simply by the determination to do what is right. What makes this story endure is the way it captures the extraordinary courage that ordinary people can summon in the face of evil. Stefania was not a soldier, not a leader, not a person of power or influence. She was a young woman, working in a shop, an ordinary person living an ordinary life. And yet, when the moment demanded it, she rose to a level of heroism that few could match, risking her life again and again to save the persecuted. Her story reminds us that heroes can come from anywhere, that the capacity for extraordinary courage dwells in the most unassuming people, and that the choice to do right, even at terrible risk, is always available to those with the strength to make it. By the time the occupation ended and freedom returned, Stefania Podgórska had accomplished something truly remarkable. She had sheltered more than a dozen people through the darkest period of the persecution, had kept them hidden and fed and safe, even with the enemy living in her own home, had borne the immense danger and responsibility with extraordinary courage and skill, and had saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. Her achievement stands as one of the great acts of individual heroism of the war, a shining example of what one person's courage and compassion can accomplish even against the greatest evil. So remember Stefania Podgórska, the young shopkeeper who hid more than a dozen people in her home, who kept them safe even with German soldiers billeted under the same roof, who bore the unbearable weight of their lives with a courage that defies comprehension. Remember that she was just a teenager, that she chose to risk everything to save the persecuted, that she maintained her extraordinary deception day after day with the enemy underfoot. And remember the deep truths her story reveals, that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary heroism, that the choice to help remains available even in the darkest times, and that against the vast machinery of evil, the simple courage of one person refusing to let the innocent be destroyed can be one of the most powerful forces in the world.